In this first series of videos, we're going to introduce some of the key thematics of the module and interrogate this object that we are taking as the center of our attention this year, which is that of war. And we would have to begin by observing that we live truly in a world that is shot through with the experience, activity and anticipation of war. War exists which is to say that war exists in our past, our present and our future. We can find a trace of war throughout human history, almost as far back as we can look. There are debates about the anthropological origins of war, and we need not get too concerned with these, simply to note that clearly, as far as the historical record notes, war has been an omnipresent feature. It is certainly a human activity that has shaped the mythological and religious imaginaries of human societies across the world, and is woven deeply into historical memories, national narratives, embedded in our culture, our language, our art. We conceive differently of our cultures and our societies without this referent of war. Today, war continues to be intertwined with economy, science, and technology. And yet, while war may seem very familiar to us, it is also simultaneously an enigma, replete with paradoxes and ambivalences. It is persistent, it recurs, and yet it always seems to be changing. One of the greatest difficulties we can encounter is in trying to define war. It's something that we find to be quite an elusive concept, because the forms of it seems to be always shifting. Think particularly in our time about the various ways in which war has been qualified. We talk about cold wars, new wars, asymmetric wars, hybrid wars, cyber wars, and so on. Wars that in many cases look very different from what we would conventionally understand to be war, and some might even query whether we should even be referring to them as war. Indeed, in the time in which we live in the 21st century, there is a growing sense that war, as it appears to us today, can no longer be grasped by reference to traditional understandings. That's to say, to think of war as something that is fought between states, that is centered around set-piece battles, that possesses a distinct temporality of peacetime and wartime, a clearly defined beginning and end. All of these things do not really correspond to the conflicts that we are seeing today. And it is a theme that we'll return to throughout the year. War is also paradoxical. After all, it involves a careful preparation by intensely ordered institutions. Think about how ordered and disciplined a military conventionally is. And yet all this organization is there so that we can wield force for political ends. We're talking here about the organization of destruction, which again is a kind of paradoxical notion. And for all the effort put into controlling and directing war, according it to political designs, war is also chaotic. It is also unpredictable. It persistently slips out of the control of its would-be masters. Wars do not follow very clearly predetermined courses. Indeed, if a war was predictable from the outset, there would be no need for it. The combatants would simply recognize its outcome before it had even occurred. There's an inherent irreducible unpredictability to the activity of war. War also, of course, reshapes societies radically. It's not merely that war is an instrument that societies use, but war itself is an intense moment in the life of these societies that can completely reconfigure their politics, their social relations, their ideologies, and their very identities. Finally, war offers one of the most extreme experiences available to those who traverse it. One that presents the opportunity for the expression of both the most abject and noble traits of our species, where abysses of cruelty and callousness cohabit with feats of courage and selfless abnegation. Ultimately, war confronts us as nothing else with our finitude in this universe, a site in which individual and collective death is given and received. In war, we see the suspension of usual social prohibitions against killing. Indeed, killing is positively encouraged and incited, even if it's usually morally bound by certain rules and norms, certain ideas of what good killing and bad killing might be. We see in war individuals exhibiting unusual willingness to endure risk and even embrace sacrifice for the group, be that of the immediate entourage, that's to say the fellow soldiers with which one is combating, or for the more abstract collective that soldiers are a part of, the nation or the wider social group. And yet, if war is a site where individuals are killed, it is also the royal road to a form of immortality. No figures survive longer in historical memory than war leaders or great warrior figures. Now, when we look at the way in which war has been approached in the social sciences, in the humanities and so forth, we will find that very often there is something of a division within that literature, where on the one side we find a tradition of military history that details in goes to great detail in narrating particular conflicts and battles. We also find on the same side of this a strategic thinking that is concerned with what's the best way to use military force. How do we think rationally, purposefully about war? But on the other side, we see a lot of historical research and social science on the other, which tends to, in fact, neglect war quite significantly. So it seems, certainly at a brief overview of the literature and the tradition of scholarly writing, that on the one hand we can find incredibly detailed accounts of war, how to conduct war, or what are the best tactics to conduct war, or very detailed military histories of what happened on a field on a particular day, and so forth. But most of this literature is quite detached from wider writings in the humanities and social sciences. It tends to be quite atheoretical, quite weakly conceptualized, quite narrative in style, or simply concerned with instrumental applications, how to guide, how to inform, how to advise governments, states, political masters into how to use war. But on the other side, when we look at the wider social sciences, the neglect comes from often thinking about war as episodic bouts of organized violence, something that just punctually interrupts the regular course of political and social life. In other words, war is exceptional, war does not reflect society beyond that particular moment, and in some ways we can bracket it out. We can think about what the causes of war might be. We don't need to think much about what happens in war itself, because it is a form of social aberration. And one of the reasons for that is that many of the founding thinkers of the social science in the 19th centuries subscribed to the very common view of the time that war was an atavism, that's to say it was an archaic remnant of feudal societies, that as liberal bourgeois societies developed, war was actually going to fade away. And certainly if you stood in Europe in the 19th century, you might have lived through what was referred to as the Long Peace between 1815 and the end of the 19th century, in which there were no major conflicts, or very few major conflicts between European powers. And this may have given a sense that war was no longer the way in which politics was going to be disputed. Now, of course, this is a very partial vision, because at the very same time, European states were using considerable amounts of force in colonial ventures across the world. But nonetheless, from the European perspective, the illusion might have stood. An illusion, of course, that was going to be completely shattered in 1914 with the advent of the First World War. But the point I'm trying to make here really is that we in some ways have inherited some of the biases of these original thinkers and this original foundation of the social sciences. And because of that, war has often been a neglected subject that hasn't been integrated into wider social and political theory. So part of the remit of this module is to stand against this dichotomy that I've just outlined to you. That on the one hand, it's not sufficient to look at war from this narrow historical strategic perspective. We need to inform that through a much wider understanding of society, of social and political theory. And conversely, we need to bring in the experience of war, the conduct of war, into mainstream social scientific thinking and writing. And so the real purpose of this module is to interrogate the co-constitutive relationship of war, politics and society in the modern era. What I mean by modern era, and I think this is an important concept that we'll return to regularly, is really what is referred to generally by historians as modernity. And modernity, so to be modern is not merely to be contemporary, as the term might be used in common parlance, but modernity refers quite specifically, I mean the definitions are fluid, but effectively we're talking about the period of the last 3, 4, maybe 500 years in which we saw the emergence of the nation state, of the capitalist mode of production, of techno-scientific discovery and invention, and the advent of mass politics. In fact, basically all the major features of the societies that we identify can be located within this kind of modern paradigm. We will go, okay, I mean occasionally the course will range further back to the ancient world and to other parts of the world in order to draw contrast with the present, but our main focus will be on this modern period, and of course to a large extent on the 20th and the 21st century. But we will look at the foundations of the modern period, the rise of the state, the advent of certain kinds of conceptions of the modern individual and modern society that are critical to understand our societies and the way in which they wage war. Really, fundamentally, the module starts from the position that we live in a modern world that has been profoundly shaped by the historical experience of war, and in which organized violence remains omnipresent, whether it is being waged here and now, or simply latent in the armed forces that continually prepare for it.